Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, where we answer questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's incredible team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized for the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, Tim, this week's question came from a submission we received on the website, and that question is from Javier. And he asks, would it be wise or too risky to use whatever amount of money from emergency savings to completely wipe out student loan debt? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I think it can be so tempting to look at that like bucket of money and say, hey, I have $20,000 in my emergency fund and I have $20,000 or $15,000 left for my student loans, and kind of make the leap to repurpose that, so to speak. The way that I try to talk to, clients about the emergency fund is almost that it doesn't exist, because we really shouldn't be using that at all in any type of like debt service or invest in. That typically you see that as like, oh, I need to buy, more of Amazon because it tanked yesterday, or Bitcoin or whatever. So, I think there's a lot of factors that are involved in this, Tim. Like if I was like, Javier, if you're a single guy and no one's relying on you, I mean, that might be an easier thing. The book is going to say, don't do it. Right.
Yeah.
We were reminded of this, Tim, and I remember having a conversation with you about it. Is, when coronavirus happened, there was a downturn in the market.
Yeah.
It was kind of that it was a reminder, like, oh yeah, that's why. There was uncertainty about businesses staying open, jobs. So it was like, that's why the emergency fund is there. So, I think that, when I look at student loans, it's not predatory debt as much as a thorn in there. It is a thorn in the side of many of our listeners and many pharmacists. It's not like credit card debt where you're paying, 18, 20%. The interest rates here are lower. And then I think you can make a case to hold on to the cash, because interest rates are higher in high yield savings accounts. I think in Ally, which is who I use to bank, and that's where my emergency fund, I think it's like 2.35%. So if my student loans are 6, I mean, that's not, so mathematically, I think you can make a case that it might make sense. But the thing that I would say is, like, cash is king when there's uncertainty. And I would say there's a lot of uncertainty with the economy, volatility in the market, the student loan situation in terms of like, will there be forgiveness? Will there not be forgiveness? When's the pause when are we gonna unpause? And you just don't know when there's a job loss on the horizon, a medical bill, a home maintenance bill, or a car maintenance bill that you're going to need to, pony up some cash. And what you really want to avoid is having to swipe that credit card, and then you kind of get into that cycle of, trying to pay that down. So again, all things being equal, having that cushion, just from a peace of mind perspective, like if you say, okay, now that account is down to 0, like, how does that make you feel? You probably feel pretty good about the student loans, but not necessarily great about the fact that, like, you're basically flying without a safety net. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's great insights, Tim. And I think one of the questions too that came to mind here is, is this all federal debt? Is there,
Sure. Yep.
private debt that, sometimes we see pretty high interest rates on the private side, that maybe there's an opportunity to, refinance it, get that down a little bit lower. But even then, your comment, I think here we're talking about emergency savings, right? It's not additional savings on top of the emergency fund. The question is, should I potentially draw from my emergency savings to completely wipe out the student loan debt? So the other thing that came to mind, Tim, as you were talking, actually, Jess and I have lived this firsthand in the last year, is that I think sometimes things can be more fluid than we might think in the moment, right? So we put our, eyes on the crystal ball and, like, okay, here's the needs we see coming to, the next 3, 6, 12 months. And, you make a decision to move funds from one account to another. And sometimes you can't undo those moves, right? Other moves, maybe you can, but whether it's, putting money towards a debt, whether it's, making contributions to a certain account, obviously you could undo some of those with some penalties and things, but things can be more fluid, I think, than sometimes we think they can. And to your comment, like, just kind of forget about the emergency fund being there. I think that really speaks to those examples where things might move and change throughout the year that we weren't predicting,
Yeah.
to happen. And if we've got money in that emergency account, we've got options. If we don't, we lose some of those options. So.
Yeah. And I think like I see this more in like not necessarily student loans. I see this kind of question or action more in a home purchase situation.
Yes, that's right.
Which is much, much more emotional, where it's like we could get this home if we scrape the pot, and part of the pot is going to be the emergency fund.
Yeah.
And again, I don't there's probably a lot of people out there like, that's me. And like, I'm not hating, right? I get it. I understand it. But, all things being equal, we want to, kind of partition that account off and not touch it. So we talk about like having bucketed savings. So in our household, we have a travel fund that we have, for different trips that we're going to go on Disney World. And we have a home maintenance account, and we have just different sinking funds that we are saving towards. So if the decision were, hey, we're going to scrape the pot for something that came up, I would be more likely to do that and then to backfill my savings there, as long as the emergency fund is kind of still, taken care of and kind of blocked off. So yeah, it's a tough thing, right? Money's fungible, kind of sometimes we can be prisoners of the moment in terms of like, what's the thing that excites us the most right now, which could be a house, or what's the thing that annoys us the most right now, which could be a debt that we want to pay off quickly. But one of the sayings, is when in doubt, zoom out, right? So think of it, more broadly. And it's hard for us sometimes to think, in terms of longer periods of time. So I don't think there's any wrong answer. I think the textbook would say don't do it. Yeah. But, I think if, your circumstance lines up, maybe, but I would lean towards not. I would just leave it alone.
Great stuff, Tim and Javier. Thanks again for submitting your question to be featured on this week's segment of the YFP podcast. And we're going to be sending Javier a super comfy YFP t-shirt as a small thank you for taking the time to submit his question. And if you have a question, we'd love to hear from you. 2 ways that you can submit that. Number one, you can send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com, or you can also go directly to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP, and you can submit an audio recording of your question. As we wrap up this week's episode, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on this, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your week.